Hello everyone, and welcome to another series on C&C Productions, my audiobook slash audio drama of my first ARK novel. Now, I was recently PM'd on FanFiction about doing this. Someone asked if I could do an ARK audiobook, and I thought it was a pretty good idea. So I'm going to be posting me reading the first of my ARK novels here on YouTube. Yeah, I'm going to have music in the background and sound effects so that it stays a little bit more interesting. So yeah, I wrote this first ARK novel all the way back in 2015, and yeah, so there were a few parts of it that weren't quite as honed as I would have liked. Like, my writing skills weren't quite as good as they are today. I'm actually in the middle of writing the second book in the series this year. I started it late last year. I have kind of lost a little bit of momentum, but I'm trying to get back into it. But yeah, I didn't want this to be completely left alone because it's actually been getting a lot of positive feedback on FanFiction. At least, you know, for me anyway. It's the most popular one that I've uploaded there. So yeah, I'm going to be reading chapters 1 through 33. Each of them will be on separate videos. There will be music and sound effects included along with my general reading. So yeah, I hope you guys can enjoy the book. I will probably be doing the second book as well, uploading videos for the chapters as I write them. Don't worry, this won't interrupt regular content. I will still be posting my regular gameplay or how to draw or whatever alongside these videos, so this won't end up being what the channel becomes. But there will be quite a few videos on this first book just because there's over 30 chapters, so that's over 30 videos. So yeah, hope you guys enjoy. Just a quick note before we dive in. This book isn't quite based as much on ARK lore as my second book, because obviously the lore for ARK wasn't quite as complete back in 2015 as it is now, with all the DLC along with Extinction. I actually wrote this before Scorched Earth came out. So there are obviously some parts of the novel that don't go along with ARK lore quite as closely as they should. I never mentioned the obelisks in this book. I do in the second one. I never mentioned the implants. Those will all be explained away in the second book. So yeah, without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into ARK Book 1. I hope you guys enjoy. Chapter 1. Stranded. Villages in Africa were sometimes busy, sometimes not. This one was as busy as it gets. "That's great," said a voice. The other voice replied, "Yes, it is. Best of luck to you, David. You sure did deserve that promotion." It was James Castor, a professional explorer, survivalist, and animal trainer. His career had started back in 1996, and he was able to build up the society he had a hand in raising up. It was known as the ESC, or the Explorer Society of the Congo. It was a society that specialized in cryptozoology and probing ever deeper into the Congo's depths. James was talking to David, a member of the ESC, congratulating him on his promotion. David was a quiet man, and soon he hurried off back to the meeting. "I'll see you there, David," James called back. David waved and walked over to the clubhouse just outside the village. Amakoko village was busier than a normal village since it was the last one before the deep jungle of the Congo. You're on your own after that. James was average height, just barely over 6 feet tall, and with short brown hair that went up at the front. He had blue eyes and a face with a near-permanent smile on it. He'd grown up in America, and had always had an extreme interest in the outdoors and with animals both living and extinct. In his teenage years, he had decided to become a survivalist. Later, he had helped found the ESC, his friend George Anderson becoming co-executive. James kept walking briskly along, looking down the main road. The marketplace he was at was full of people buying items. He went up to one of the booths and slowly let his nose take in the overwhelming aroma of the spices there. He kept walking along until he saw the clubhouse, a large thatched hut, where he would meet the 50 or so people on the team. He walked inside and saw the podium where he would announce the beginning of the mission. He was the president of this particular club, and some of his friends were there. David usually kept to himself and explored on his own. He was tall and muscular, with short black hair and military-style clothing. He was a mercenary before he went into the army. David then left the army after his tour of duty to enter the ESC, but his naturally quiet, serious mood stuck with him, causing some to call him a stoic, which was more or less true. Over in the corner was Shira, an Israeli woman who had been admitted to the club since her father was friends with the CEO. She was also quiet, though her quietness didn't echo of confidence like David. She always seemed to be sad and depressed as if something terrible had happened. James had tried to break the ice with her, but she never really opened up. Though James didn't have any romantic attachments to her, he liked her. Shira was slim, with green eyes and long, flowing black hair. She was in her middle 20s and was average height. Even though she was sometimes gloomy, she was happiest when she was in the field. James had admired Shira work with large animals, and she had such a way with them. Lions and tigers, which had given trainers trouble day after day, Shira could tame after a few short days of work. She was often hired out by zoos or animal sanctuaries to help them control their troublesome animals. She'd once been much happier, and James considered her a very happy person for some years. But since the last 2 or so years, James reckoned, she had become sad and gloomy, though she never talked about it. McClure was also there. He was extremely skilled at taming animals and had been around African predators his entire life. Brian was the newest hire, and he had been admitted due to his knowledge of field equipment. There were many other faces there. James looked at them all with a smile. He stepped up on the podium, got out his notes, and began to speak. Okay, well, welcome to the Explorer Society of the Congo. We have many people here from many countries today, and on this mission, we will be going into the heart of the Congo by helicopter. There's a large double-rotor copter waiting on the side of the village helipad. We'll all be going there and traveling down to the Congo's heart. One of the reasons for this mission is to discover any new species of animals in the area. He continued for another hour, answering various questions, filling out rosters, and then the entire team entered the huge helicopter and lifted off. There was a tiny airstrip on the edge of the jungle where they were going. They were going off in search of new landmarks in the Congo. It was one of the least explored areas in the world, and they were about to explore it. They would fly above a small part of the ocean and then, after landing on the strip just inside the jungle, go into the jungle to explore. One of their goals was to find new animal species, hence the amount of animal handlers, and also to find any new landmarks in the Congo. After a few hours in the air, James went up to the cockpit. He had some piloting experience, though he hadn't been in one of these big choppers for several years. He admired the controls for a while before he looked over at the pilot. "Doing all right?" he asked. "Yep, nearly ready for takeoff," responded the pilot. James went back to the main chamber. The chopper was wide, with a large middle lane full of supplies and 2 long bench seats that went the length of the cockpit. He passed Shira, who gave him a weak smile, which made James wince inside. He had tried to get Shira to open up time and again, but nothing helped. He sat near the front of the group. Shira had gotten high up in the ranks since her father was a good friend of the CEO. That much he knew about her. He looked down at his watch, 12:47 p.m. He said to himself. Another few hours and they reached the ocean. A few hours later and they were above the ocean, but there was a big problem. The pilot called James up to the cockpit. James looked at it. "What's the matter?" asked James. The pilot pointed at the sky. There was a tremendous thunderstorm gathering right above them. There was no avoiding it. James tried his best to remain calm. They didn't call for a storm. James was right. The weather forecast, which should have been extremely trustworthy, had gone terribly wrong. The pilot strapped in and yelled back for everybody to hold on. The pilot tried to turn away from the storm. The storm was too fast, however, and the rain suddenly pelted down on the cockpit windshield. James gritted his teeth and watched as lightning flashed, turning the sky a blinding white before turning black again. The wind came up, which was the pilot's worst enemy. If a large enough sudden gust of wind hit the propellers, the copter would lose control and crash. Then the worst did happen. An overwhelming gust of wind smashed into the propellers, which caused the helicopter to flip. Everybody in the chopper was flying, supplies flying, and then they spiraled down to the ground. The last thing James remembered was a gigantic splash, and then everything went dark. He woke up bobbing in a corner of the helicopter. He was in an air pocket, and the rest of him was surrounded by water. This frightened him almost to death. He knew he was underwater. He gasped and looked around for something he could use. There was an axe in the corner he was in. He thought, but if he were to hack out a part of the helicopter's skin, water would pour into the air pocket. He knew he wasn't in very deep. There was some light leaking through the open parts of the copter, and if he was deep, the pressure would have crushed into the porthole. There was no oxygen tanks in the helicopter near him. He thought he could swim down and see if there was a way out, but that would mean swimming away from the air pocket. He wasn't about to do that. He decided to risk it, die in the air pocket, or swim out. He reached out and took the axe, and with one mighty swing, he smashed a huge hole into the helicopter's skin. Water poured into the hole. He swung one last time, opening up the hole considerably. He tore open the rest of the hole with his adrenaline-fueled hands, breathed a huge breath, and swam up to the surface with all his might. He was about 25 feet down. He got to the surface and gasped. He looked for land, and there it was, about a mile or two away. He swam with what energy he had remaining, As he reached the shore, he let the waves help him. Then at last, reaching the beach, he crawled to the shore. He laid flat on the sand, exhausted and soaked. He feebly looked up, shaking. The tree line was strangely shaped, as if he had crashed on some tropical island. His head hit the sand and he fell unconscious from exhaustion. When he awoke, he saw where he was. This was a tropical island. He couldn't see any land near where they were. There was a cliff near the beach and rocks everywhere. There was a forest behind a large field. He stumbled up and covered his face in his hands. His eyes were blurred, and it took James a bit to adjust. His head was pounding, with pain hammering on his skull like a rhythmic sledgehammer. When he finally got everything into focus, James saw where he was. It looked very different from the thick jungles of the Congo. The beach was long, with rocks and logs covering it. He got to his feet and began slowly walking down the beach, looking for any signs of survivors. He suddenly saw some sort of animal pacing down the beach in front of him. It looked like it was on two legs, and it was quite big. He couldn't see clearly. He began walking towards it, but he suddenly felt horribly dizzy and fell to the ground. He tried to get up. After a bit of a struggle, he got on his feet. He slowly walked towards where the animal was. When he saw it closer, he had to rub his eyes in disbelief. No, it couldn't be. But it was. The animal was a dinosaur, something that had been extinct for thousands of years. Upon closer inspection, he saw it was a type of hadrosaur called Parasaurolophus. James gasped. This was almost too amazing to be true. He kept looking in amazement. It honked with its bizarre crest and looked at James. He tried to reach out and touch it. The Parasaurolophus simply let him do it. James could hardly believe it. An extinct animal still here on the Earth. Well, he'd at least discovered some new animal species. He also saw a huge tortoise near the Parasaurolophus. He had heard of giant extinct tortoises called carbonomes, meaning giant turtle, and there was one on the beach as well. James was having a hard time taking all this in. What could this mean? This was, possibly, an island where dinosaurs or supposedly extinct animals had lived in isolation. He wasn't sure where the name came to him or why, but he decided to name this place ARK Island. James was a bit boggled about how the island could have remained undiscovered with all the sonar and radars and satellites orbiting and scanning the Earth. He wasn't quite sure exactly how large the island was, or how far away it was from any other land source. Wherever he was, he needed to find out if there were any other survivors. He kept looking down the shore. He was hoping some people had survived the crash. The last thing he wanted was to be alone on this mysterious island. He yelled out, "Hello, is anybody there? Anyone alive? Survivors?" Nothing. He knew they could be anywhere, but that was the terror of it. He searched desperately, shouting the entire time. Then, after a few hours, he saw smoke. He ran toward it and gasped in relief. There was David and Brian. Shira was also there. They seemed to be the only survivors. James let out a sigh of relief as he ran towards them. David looked over and saw him. "James! James!" Shira looked over and sat bolt upright. Then she got up and she and David began jogging over. "Oh, James, you're alive," Shira said, sounding relieved. James nodded and looked around. "Is there anybody else?" he asked. David shook his head. "No. If there's anyone else, we haven't found them yet." "What is this place? There's creatures here. Extinct creatures. How is that possible?" James didn't reply. "We need to form a plan," James said. "Assess our situation. Then we can look for more survivors." They each discussed their own story, and then talked of survival plans. The helicopter was at the bottom of the ocean, and they might be the only survivors. Shira had escaped by jumping from the chopper moments before it hit the water. David had done the same. Tom and Brian were both stuck in the chopper's safety restraints, but struggled free just before they drowned. "James, I think I saw you hit your head against something, and then you were thrown from your seat. I thought you were dead," David said. "I should be," James replied. "Now, for all we know, we're the only survivors. There may be others, though, so let's comb the beach a bit more." They agreed, but just as they began to disperse, a man came charging down the beach. It was Tom. "Oh, you're alive," Tom said. "I've been running down the beach for several hours." "Tom, I'm so glad you're alive," James said. "Did you see any other survivors? Anybody at all?" Tom didn't smile. "No, I saw the others in the chopper. They were all dead." James's face went pale. "What do you mean?" "I had to swim through the chopper's body to escape. I was at the back chamber when we crashed. When I got out, there was everyone just floating in the water." Tom crashed on the ground and put his face in his hands. James's face went pale. "Well, then we are alone." A moment of silence ensued as each began to truly understand what that meant. "Let's make some shelter," James said before they all nodded and began to work. The last thing James saw was Shira putting her face in her hands before he went into the jungle in search of timber. They each built a lean-to, as all the people present were survivalists, or at least had decent survival training. They all could hardly believe that there were extinct animals alive on the island. James looked up in the sky and saw a large flying animal. It was a pteranodon, or at least that's what he thought. He went back to the beach, wondering what he saw. There was another Parasaurolophus along the beach, and a new creature, a dodo bird. He looked at it. The dodo looked back to James. He tried to capture it, and when he did, he killed it with a stone to the head. "Let's see if this thing is edible," he said to himself. Later that night, the survivors had roasted dodo. McClure, another one of the survivors, was the first one to try it. He chewed it a bit and swallowed. "It's a bit tough. Not as good as roast chicken, but not too bad." The rest tried some and agreed with McClure. The next cut they roasted for a little bit less time. It worked. The dodo was a bit less tough. The taste was more gamey than chicken, though it had a chicken's consistency. They started constructing a thatch hut the following day. They gathered palm leaves, set up branches as supports, and by nightfall it was done. At least they had some kind of roof over their heads. Later that night, James went off by himself out into the beach. He looked up at the immense expanse of ocean and sky above him. One was as black as coal, scattered with stars shining like diamonds. The other was the deepest blue possible, which was seemingly eternal and unable to be crossed. He looked out into it, wondering if he'd ever be able to see home again. James felt sunlight beaming into his eyes before he opened them. Slowly his eyes opened and he saw sunlight pouring in through the thatch roof. He got up off of his floor mat and looked around. Most of the dodo meat had been eaten the night before, and he decided to try foraging around the area. Close to the camp, there were some berry patches. James knew what any survivalist knows about food that you don't know about. To see if it's poisonous, touch it to your skin. If nothing comes up in 4 hours, touch it to your tongue. If nothing comes up for 4 more hours, swallow a little bit. Nothing after that, and you know that it's safe to eat. James did this with a berry that looked like a raspberry but was blue. He called them azul berries, and they were safe to eat. He also found little yellow berries that were the size of a pea. They were inedible, since the inside was basically a huge seed. He called these amar berries. There were other types, one that looked like black cherries he called tinto berries, and those were edible. He named another purple type that looked like a blueberry a majo berry. The majo berry was very sweet, and was James's favorite out of the ones that he tried. There were also small white berries called stim berries, which turned out to be quite bitter. The last type of berry they found was jet black and the size of a grape. McClure was the first person to try one. After eating a few, he soon became dizzy, and then he fell down, knocked unconscious. James was worried McClure may have been poisoned, but McClure woke up a few hours later unharmed. It turned out that the little black berries had a certain toxin in them that would cause the consumer to fall asleep on the spot. But after waking up, they wouldn't suffer any adverse effects. James called these narcoberries. A few days later, they had built a more solid base. They had made a fire in a single building, but they knew they'd be here for a long, long time, possibly for good. James was exploring the area. He saw something rush across the field and chase down a Parasaurolophus. He stared in terror. It was a large dromaeosaur called Utah Raptor. He carefully went back to the base and warned everybody. "There are raptors in the area," he said. The others and James were getting hungry. He needed to find out what food was in the area. A steady supply of berries to eat wouldn't sustain them for long. He went down to the beach. He waded into the warm water, looking around for some fish, a large rock in his hand. He saw what looked like a coelacanth in the water. It was a coelacanth. He got right above the fish, which, not being afraid of man, did nothing as James raised the rock above his head. He threw it down on the fish's head with all his might. The fish was stunned just long enough for James to drag it out of the water and finish it off. He took it to camp, filleted it, and ate it, sharing some with the rest of the people. Coelacanth could grow up to 5 feet long, which was a lot of meat. This one was about 2 feet long, giving each person a decent serving. He went back along the beach the next day and saw a shark. He was terrified. Now there were raptors on land and huge sharks in the water. It was about 20 feet long with orange stripes. For all he knew, it might be a juvenile megalodon. He was right. When he went back to shore, he met Shira standing on the beach. It was windy, and her black hair was flowing in the air like wisps of smoke. She was standing as still as a statue, looking dead on at the horizon in a way that made James shudder. James decided to go up and talk to her. He waved over to her, and she looked his way, not smiling, just looking, almost coldly. But the coldness wasn't directed at James. James had the strangest sensation that the coldness in her face was directed at her herself. It was a strange feeling, but it almost seemed to James as if she was grieving about something. James couldn't see what or why. Shira looked instantly away. "Shira, what's the matter?" Shira shook her head. "Nothing, James. Really, nothing. It's..." James felt as he couldn't say anything. He and Shira had always been friends, and sometimes Shira would confide in James. "Shira, really, what's wrong?" "I'm just remembering. When I lived in Israel, my dad would always take me to the Mediterranean Sea to watch the waves. He'd just sit beside me and we'd watch the water until the sun set. He stopped doing it when..." James didn't decide to push it. Though he wanted to help, he certainly didn't ask about what or who she was talking about. "It's all right," she said reassuringly. Shira looked into James's eyes, and she looked back into the water. James sighed and put a hand on Shira's shoulder. She put her hand on James's. "Thank you, James." James nodded, and they each looked into the water. He went out again in search of more dodos. He carried another rock in his hand and looked around. He found a group of 3. He picked the fattest one and flung the rock. It hit its mark. Practicing rock throwing as a kid had finally paid off. They all had more roast dodo to eat, and as James went for a walk along the beach that evening, he saw another Parasaurolophus. He really wanted to have one. The other one he saw didn't seem that hard to tame. If he could just be able to make a saddle, he'd get one. He shook off the notion. This wasn't Dinotopia. It was a hazardous, dangerous place that James knew almost nothing about. He decided to try and make something useful. He got some wood for a stone pick. That would be useful. He carved a stone into the pickaxe shape, and then took a large wooden branch, and then bound his creation with fiber and thatch. Now he had a tool. He began gathering more stone with it, to make more weapons or tools. Shira had been around the camp, but she still seemed upset, even worse than when she was in the ESC. James had tried to help, but she had seemed to almost exclude herself from all camp activities. He decided to leave her alone. Chances were she was working out something in her soul. He didn't want to interfere with that process, which he had to do himself sometimes. Hopefully she'd perk up soon, and James hoped that someday he'd be able to help find her the healing that she needed. As he returned to camp, he saw another new dinosaur which was large and 4-legged, with 3 horns on its head. It was about 30 feet long. It was a Triceratops. He watched as the dinosaur walked off. He wanted to know about all the dinosaurs on the island. There seemed to be so many. On the way back to the base, he spotted yet another new dinosaur. It was about 6 feet long and had a small frill. James looked at it and said, "Is that a Dilophosaurus?"